Multiply one number by 43,200 and something impossible happens. Take the height of a single building standing in the Egyptian desert, a building finished more than 4,000 years ago by people who were supposed to have used copper chisels and wooden sledges, and multiply it by that figure, and the result lands on the polar radius of planet Earth, the exact distance from the center of the world to its pole. Multiply the distance around its base by the same number, and you get the circumference of the Earth at the equator. Not close, not approximately, within a margin so small that professional surveyors today would call it a rounding error. A tomb built by hand in the Bronze Age, carrying the dimensions of the entire planet folded into its stone. That is the number that stopped an artificial intelligence mid-analysis in 2024. And it is the number we are going to sit with for the next several minutes, because once you understand what it means, you cannot unsee it. But before we go further, we have to be honest about something else, something that makes this story far stranger than a simple mystery. We already know who built the Great Pyramid. We are not guessing. Archaeologists have walked through the workers' village at the base of the Giza Plateau, seen the bakeries where bread was made by the thousands of loaves, the breweries, the barracks where laborers slept, the cattle bones left over from meals eaten 45 centuries ago. They have found the healed fractures in skeletons, broken bones that were set and cared for, proof that these were not disposable slaves, but valued workers whose injuries were treated. They have read the administrative records written in ink on papyrus, logging the daily movement of stone. They have found the names crews gave themselves, painted in red ochre on blocks that were never meant to be seen again once the casing stones went up, gangs calling themselves things like the Friends of Khufu, proud enough of their work to sign it in a place no living person was ever supposed to look. This is not speculation. This is a mountain of physical evidence. And that is exactly what makes the next part so disturbing. We know who. We do not know how. The gap between those two facts is where this story lives, and it is a gap that has only gotten wider the more precisely we have been able to measure the stone. Here is the incident that reopened the whole question. In 2024, researchers ran an unusual experiment. Instead of asking an artificial intelligence system a leading question about ancient mysteries, they fed it something closer to a raw case file. Every published survey measurement of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, every geological scan, every astronomical alignment reading, every engineering tolerance that has ever been recorded about the structure, and they gave it one instruction: analyze this without loyalty to any existing theory and report only what the numbers say. No mythology, no agenda, just the data. What came back was not a name, not a new suspect to replace the pharaoh, but something quieter and more unsettling, a systematic dismantling of the assumption that the accepted explanation was actually complete. To understand why that mattered, you need to understand the accepted explanation first, and you need to hear it stated fairly, because it is not a lazy story. Around 2560 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the pharaoh Khufu commissioned a tomb. Over roughly 20 years, crews of skilled laborers, organized and rotated in shifts, quarried limestone from the plateau itself, floated finer stone down the Nile from quarries further south, dragged the blocks across wetted sand on wooden sledges to reduce friction, and raised them into position using ramps, levers, ropes, and enormous coordinated manpower. Their tools were copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden mallets. Their instruments for measuring were knotted cords for distance, plumb bobs for vertical lines, wooden set squares for right angles, and shallow trenches filled with water to find a level surface, since water always finds its own horizontal plane. This is the textbook version, and for the labor, the logistics, and the motive, it holds up remarkably well under scrutiny. The problem is not who moved the stone. The problem is how anyone achieved this level of accuracy with those tools. And the closer modern surveying equipment looks at the Great Pyramid, the less that question resolves itself. Before we go anywhere else, it is worth pausing on how much of the ordinary story is genuinely solid, because the mystery only means something if you respect the evidence around it rather than ignore it. The quarries where the limestone was cut still show tool marks from the copper chisels that shaped them. Ramps and construction debris have been identified nearby, evidence of the logistics required to move stone at this scale. Papyrus logs discovered near the Red Sea describe, in the actual handwriting of a supervisor, the day-by-day movement of limestone blocks by boat down the Nile toward Giza, complete with complaints about delays and food shortages, the kind of mundane bureaucratic detail nobody invents for a myth. This is a workforce with names, schedules, grievances, and a chain of command. None of that is in question. What is in question is a much narrower, much stranger problem sitting on top of all that solid ground, and it is the part of the story that keeps refusing to close. Start with the floor, because this is the most boring measurement imaginable, and it is also the first crack in the story. Across a base spanning roughly 230 meters on each side, a footprint you could lay more than 2 football fields across, the entire foundation is level to within about 2 centimeters. 2 centimeters of total deviation across 230 meters of solid stone. That works out to a flatness of roughly 9/1000ths of 1%. To put that in a shape you can actually picture, imagine a sheet of glass the size of an entire city block, and across that whole surface, the highest point and the lowest point differ by less than the width of 2 fingers held side by side. Now imagine building that surface not from one poured slab, but from thousands of individual stone blocks, some as heavy as a delivery truck, each one trimmed and set into place by hand, using nothing we would recognize as a precision instrument. No laser level, no optical transit, no satellite positioning. Just water in a trough, a wooden square, a plumb line, and a trained eye. Modern construction does not demand this kind of tolerance, and that detail matters more than it sounds like it should. When engineers pour a foundation slab for a skyscraper today, the accepted allowance for level across a large surface is considerably looser than what survives at Giza. Buildings do not need floors this precise. Elevators run fine. Nobody notices a few centimeters of slope across 100 meters because nothing about a modern structure depends on it. By the standard we actually use in construction today, the Great Pyramid's foundation is roughly 10 times more precise than it has any practical reason to be for a building whose only stated function was to hold a body. That precision costs something. Every extra fraction of accuracy demands more time, more remeasuring, more rejected stone, more labor spent on something that served no functional purpose anyone has ever identified. So either the accuracy was an accident of method so refined it fell out naturally, or it was deliberate, and someone wanted a structure this exact, for reasons that have nothing to do with burying a king. There's one more detail about the leveling that rarely makes it into the popular retellings, and it deserves a moment because it makes the achievement even harder to wave away. The plateau the pyramid sits on is not naturally flat. It is real bedrock, uneven, sloping, full of the ordinary imperfections you would expect from a desert outcrop that has never been touched by tools. The builders did not find a flat surface and simply build on top of it. They had to carve away high points and, in places, fill low points, effectively sculpting a natural irregular surface into an artificial one flat enough to meet that 2 centimeter tolerance across the entire base. That means the leveling problem was not solved once at a single reference height. It was solved continuously, block by block, across an area larger than several football fields, using nothing but water, patience, and repeated correction. Every additional irregularity in the underlying rock was one more opportunity for the tolerance to slip, and it never did, not by more than a couple of centimeters across the whole structure. Then there is the orientation, and this is where the numbers stop being merely impressive and start feeling strange. The 4 sides of the Great Pyramid do not face roughly toward the compass points. They are aligned to true north, true south, true east, and true west, and the deviation from true north measured across the entire structure is on the order of 3 arc minutes, a fraction so small it is invisible to the naked eye and can only be detected with an instrument. An arc minute is 1/60th of a single degree. A full circle around the horizon is 360 degrees, or 21,600 arc minutes total, and the builders of this monument missed perfect north by roughly 3 of those units across the whole span. Understand what true north actually requires, because this is not something you stumble into. True north is not what a compass shows you. A compass follows the planet's magnetic field, which drifts and wanders over time and has moved considerably even within recorded history. True north is the geographic axis the entire Earth spins on, a fixed point that exists only in relation to the stars. To find it without modern instruments, you have to track the night sky over time, locate the pivot point around which every star appears to rotate, and then transfer that invisible celestial point down into a straight line scratched into bedrock, and hold that line true across the full 230 meters of construction without it drifting. That is the kind of accuracy we associate today with a survey-grade transit or satellite positioning, tools that would not exist for another 4,500 years. And a tomb does not need this. A monument to a king's glory does not require alignment finer than any priest or worker could ever have noticed or verified with their own eyes. The precision overshoots the purpose by such a wide margin that the alignment itself starts to look less like a technique and more like a message, something built to be measured by someone in the far future, rather than appreciated by anyone standing there at the time. From there, the story gets stranger because it moves from engineering into mathematics. Take the full perimeter of the pyramid's base, walk all 4 sides and add them together, then take the original height of the structure before its capstone and outer casing were stripped away over the centuries. Divide the first number by the second, and the result lands close to 2 times pi, the same irrational number that describes the relationship between a circle's circumference and its radius, a number that runs on forever without ever repeating. A structure built entirely from flat triangular planes has a circle hidden quietly inside its core proportions, and the match is not loose. It sits within a fraction of a percent of the true value of pi. There is a reasonable mainstream explanation for this, and it deserves to be stated fairly before anything else. Ancient Egyptian builders may have measured horizontal ground distance by rolling a drum or cylinder and counting its rotations, while measuring vertical height by stacking units called cubits. If you measure the ground with a rolling wheel, pi enters your numbers automatically, because a wheel's circumference is inherently tied to pi, whether or not the person rolling it has ever heard the concept explained. This is an elegant explanation, and for one isolated measurement, it holds up completely. The trouble is that researchers examining the full set of the pyramid's proportions have found this same ratio surfacing again at other points in the geometry, in relationships that have no obvious connection to a single rolling drum, at rates too consistent to dismiss as one lucky accident repeating itself by chance. Then there's a second number hiding in the stone, older in the record and in some ways more difficult to explain than pi. It is called phi, the golden ratio, 1. 618 and onward without ever terminating, the same proportion that shows up in the spiral of a nautilus shell and the branching pattern of tree limbs, a ratio the human eye finds naturally pleasing without knowing why. As far as the written historical record shows, this proportion was not formally described until Greek mathematicians began working with it more than 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid's last casing stone was set in place. That is roughly the same distance in time that separates us today from the height of the Roman Empire. And yet researchers examining the pyramid's proportions have identified this exact ratio appearing in at least 7 separate dimensional relationships throughout the structure. In the relationship between height and base, in the slope of the triangular faces as they lean inward toward the apex, and in proportions found within the internal chambers. This is a meaningfully different claim than the pi argument, because there is no innocent tool that produces phi by accident the way a rolling wheel produces pi. You cannot bump into the golden ratio through a measuring procedure. It has to be calculated and applied on purpose. Finding it once might be forgiven as coincidence. Finding it independently in 7 different places, woven through the height, the slope, and the internal geometry of the same building, is much harder to wave away as chance, and it is treated in the architectural literature as one of the most persistent and debated patterns in the entire structure. While the analysis was working through the mathematics, it also flagged something inside the pyramid itself, not on the surface, but buried deep within its core, in a space almost nobody who visits ever gets to see. Above the king's chamber sit a series of granite slabs, each one weighing somewhere in the range of 25 to 80 tons, stacked in a configuration engineers call relieving chambers, designed to redirect the crushing weight of millions of tons of stone above, away from the ceiling of the chamber below and out to the sides, so the room does not collapse under its own burden. That system of load distribution has held without failure, without a single structural crack in the chamber ceiling, for roughly 4,500 years, through earthquakes, through erosion, through the slow settling of the ground beneath it. Modern structural engineers who have studied the design describe it as functionally sound by contemporary standards, not merely lucky. Getting that geometry wrong, even slightly, risks the collapse of the single most important room in the entire monument, the chamber built to hold the king's body. There was no room for trial and error on a mistake that size. It had to work the first time, permanently, and it did. And that brings us back to where we started, to the number that connects the pyramid to the planet itself. Multiply the pyramid's original height by 43,200, and you land on a figure close to the Earth's actual polar radius. Multiply its base perimeter by that same number, and you land on a figure close to the Earth's equatorial circumference, the slightly larger measurement caused by the fact that our planet bulges very slightly at the middle. A subtlety of Earth's shape that was not scientifically confirmed until the era of satellite measurement. The same multiplier connects 2 entirely different dimensions of one building to 2 entirely different dimensions of the entire planet. And 43,200 is not a random number pulled from nowhere. It is the number of seconds in 12 hours, a figure tied directly to the rotation of the Earth and the division of a day into measurable units of time. So who, in the 3rd millennium before our era, working with copper tools and wooden sledges, according to the record we have, understood the polar radius of the Earth closely enough to encode it in a building? Who understood that the planet bulges slightly at its equator, a detail we ourselves did not confirm until satellites could measure it directly? And having known these things, why encode them silently into a structure that almost nobody would ever measure precisely enough to notice for thousands of years, until modern instruments finally caught up? The conventional response is that all of this is coincidence, an artifact of the units the Egyptians happened to use, numbers that will appear in any sufficiently large structure if you go looking hard enough for patterns. And that response deserves to be taken seriously, because pattern hunting in large data sets can absolutely manufacture false discoveries if you are not careful. But when you stack every finding together, rather than examining them one at a time, the picture becomes harder to dismiss with a single explanation. A foundation leveled 10 times more precisely than any practical need required. An alignment to true north tighter than any ceremony would ever demand. Pi surfacing more than once in unrelated proportions. Phi appearing independently across 7 separate relationships in a ratio that was not formally known for another 2,000 years. And the Earth's own dimensions folded into the height and base by a number lifted from the rhythm of a spinning planet. Each piece alone can be argued away individually. Together, examined as one connected body of evidence rather than a list of separate curiosities, they start to look less like scattered coincidences and more like a single, deliberate signature. This is the conclusion the analysis actually reached, and it is worth being precise about what it did and did not claim, because the honest version of this story is stranger than the sensational one. It did not name a lost civilization. It did not point to visitors from beyond the planet. It did not replace Khufu's name with anyone else's. What it did was quieter and, in its own way, far more unsettling. It looked at the standard explanation: Pharaoh, copper tools, sledges, 20 years, a Bronze Age population achieving what modern engineers consider unnecessary precision using only manual technique. And it judged that explanation insufficient to account for everything the stone actually shows, not false in every part, not a fabrication. Insufficient by the weight of its own assumptions to explain what stands on that plateau. That leaves us with an uncomfortable set of possibilities rather than a single satisfying answer. And it is worth naming them honestly rather than picking a favorite for you. Perhaps the Egyptians of this era had access to techniques and instruments that have simply not survived in the archaeological record, tools and methods lost to time, even though the people who use them are the same people the textbooks already describe. Perhaps this knowledge was inherited from an earlier culture whose direct evidence has not survived, passed down through generations the way certain skills and stories can travel long distances through oral tradition alone. Perhaps a wider, older network of human knowledge existed before the last ice age ended and was largely erased by the catastrophic changes that followed, its survivors carrying only fragments of mathematics and measurement into the new world that came after. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that makes people uncomfortable enough to change the subject, the true origin of some of this knowledge was never entirely human to begin with. There's one more piece of evidence worth mentioning before we get to the possibilities, because it does not come from inside the pyramid at all, but from the Sphinx that sits nearby on the same plateau, watching over the same complex. Geologists who have studied the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure have pointed to weathering marks that look less like the effects of thousands of years of dry desert wind and blowing sand, and more like the vertical, rounded grooves left behind by sustained heavy rainfall. The kind of rainfall this particular stretch of desert has not experienced since long before the pharaohs were ever born. That claim remains genuinely contested within geology, and mainstream Egyptologists have offered competing explanations, involving groundwater and softer limestone layers eroding unevenly over time. But it sits in the same category as everything else in this story, a detail that does not fit cleanly into either the simplest version of the standard timeline or the wildest version of the alternative one, and it keeps getting raised precisely because nobody has managed to make it disappear entirely. None of these are proven. None of them should be treated as settled fact, and treating any of them as settled fact would be exactly the mistake this whole story is warning against, replacing one comfortable story with another comfortable story just because the new one feels more exciting. What can be said honestly is that the measurements are real, verified independently by professional surveyors going back to the 1880s and repeated with modern instruments since. The mathematics is real, documented and debated in serious academic literature, not invented for viral videos. The relationship between the pyramid's proportions and the dimensions of the Earth is real, whether or not you accept that it was intentional, and the gap between what the evidence shows and what the standard explanation fully accounts for has not closed with better tools. If anything, more precise modern instruments have only made that gap easier to measure and harder to explain away. It is worth stepping back for a moment and asking why the specific question asked of an artificial intelligence system in 2024 spread the way it did, because that in itself tells you something about where we are as a culture right now. People are no longer satisfied hearing conclusions from historians or archaeologists whose careers, reputations, and academic standing are tied to defending a particular version of the past. There is a growing appetite for something that looks like a neutral referee, a system with no tenure to protect, no conference paper to defend. No institutional pressure to keep the story tidy, simply weighing the numbers as they exist and reporting whatever falls out of that weighing. Whether an artificial intelligence system can actually serve as that kind of neutral referee is itself a real and open question, since these systems are trained on the same historical record, the same academic sources, and the same online debates that shaped human opinion on this topic long before any machine was asked to weigh in. But the appeal of the idea, a system judging the pyramid purely on its numbers, stripped of institutional loyalty, is exactly why the story spread as fast and as far as it did, and why so many people who would normally dismiss a pyramid conspiracy video stopped scrolling long enough to watch this one all the way through. Somewhere on that plateau outside Cairo, a structure built by real people whose names we partly know, whose villages we have excavated, whose bread we have identified from crumbs left in ancient ovens, also contains a level of mathematical and astronomical precision that the tools those same people are recorded as using should not have been able to produce. Both things are true at once. The workers were real, the precision is real, and the space between those two facts has never actually been closed, no matter how many times the textbook version has been repeated as though it settled the question. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you strip away everything you were taught in school and look only at the stone itself, the leveling, the alignment, the pi, the phi, the Earth's own measurements, folded quietly into the height and the base, which explanation do you actually find yourself believing? A forgotten Egyptian technique lost to time. Knowledge inherited from an older culture whose evidence has not survived. A wider human civilization erased by catastrophe before the pharaohs were ever born, or something whose origin was never human at all. Whichever one you land on, the numbers themselves are not going anywhere, and they are not getting any less strange the longer we look at them.